Hey guys, making a video from my car. I got to the school that I teach at a little early, so I figured let's be productive. So there's a saying that I heard from time to time growing up that goes, "Those who can't do, teach." So I think being a teacher, it's really easy to, just dismiss that. But I'm here to say I kind of agree with it, maybe 50%. Um, so first of all, it doesn't mean that, there's a failed drummer out there who's like, oh, well, I guess I can't cut it. I'll just teach. It could also mean, maybe there's, a slowdown in work that this particular drummer is experiencing, and they're falling back economically on teaching. So it could mean that also. It doesn't necessarily have to imply that the level of education that you would receive by studying with them would be inferior. But there's also kind of another side to it. What if your main goal was to always teach? So this kind of brings me to the idea of if you're, in search of a teacher. I always think the best quality education you'll receive from a music teacher for any instrument would be from a teacher that always wanted to teach, and they're not falling back on it for any reason due to, like I was saying before, like an economic downturn or I don't know, laziness or whatever. And they're like, oh, well, I guess I'll teach. I ran into a lot of those types of drummers during COVID, when there was a lot of like online activity, Zoom lessons, if you will, and the whole gigging scene kind of collapsed. So drummers and musicians had to find some way to make a living. So I think in finding a teacher that was kind of born to teach, whether they're successful as a playing musician or touring musician or not, the drummers that were born to teach, maybe I'll speak for myself. They maybe can see a certain situation a little differently, and maybe have a skill to break it down and explain it to someone else in a way that they can understand, as opposed to, maybe there's some professional drummers out there teaching that, the best way to learn from them is just to observe what they're doing. And, I've been in situations where, a famous drummer would say, oh, I don't even know what I'm doing, but here it is. I'll play it for you. I can't explain what it is. And, of course there's value in that as well. But, to find a teacher that loves to teach, that wants to teach, that feels like, they were kind of put on earth to teach, I feel like that's going to be the best educational experience that you could have. And that leads me to telling you guys a little bit about my former teacher, a man named Sam Ulano, who I met in early 1987. He was already 67 at that point, and I was 17. And I remember first meeting him. He was very, polarizing, I guess is the word for it. But I figured, him being 67 and me 17, he might as well have been like 150 years old. And at that point, it's like, oh, wisdom. I had to, or I should say, I was fortunate that I saw the value in speaking to someone who had, a lifetime's worth of experience. And a lot of you guys may not have heard of Sam Ulano. And before this video, I did just a quick search, and I checked out some of his videos, like a little nostalgic trip. And, he's got like 145 views, and the video is like 13 years old, so it's kind of a shame. But let's just say he never made it as, a famous drummer, touring or playing live, but his huge contribution was teaching. And I remember our first lesson, when I walked into his studio, he said, it was completely serious, but I thought it was a joke. He says, I'm not going to teach you how to play the drums. And I was like, see you later. It was actually funny. But he was like, no, get back here. He says, I'm going to teach you how to make a living playing drums. And I was like, ooh, tell me more. Because I had always, I wanted to play drums to make a living at it. I didn't want to play drums just as a fun hobby and, be a weekend warrior, so to speak. So his whole thing was to teach his students how to read music. Because on one sense, if you take what he said literally, I want to teach you how to make a living, you would have to know how to read and, for that matter, write charts to be able to do any kind of, like to work on Broadway or any, jingles and, for TV and movies, just understanding how to read music. So in a very literal way, that made sense. But I soon came to find out the other meaning behind that. And that was learning how to read music and, how to count and understand these complex rhythmic phrases was really the brain's education, or, the way that you would make your brain the drummer. And then it would just be about translating what you've learned mentally to your hands, and then how to apply that knowledge. So his whole thing was, get your brain to understand what you're doing, and then your brain controls the body. And then, once you have a clear idea of what it is that you want to set out to do, then your brain will just have your body do it. Now, obviously, there's practicing involved to be able to think about whatever figures we were reading, and to learn how to, of course, count them well. So there was practicing involved to kind of get that communication between brain and body going, but that was the main focus. So learning how to read music was educating the brain, learning how to count and kind of speak the rhythm. Some drummers call it singing. Learning how to speak the rhythms was his way of, I guess, like having the brain and the body communicate through speaking the counting. And then your body would have to, I'm in my car. And then your body would have to perform those tasks. So I've taken that my entire life, and, I do teach pretty much that method in my own private, teaching life. I add to it and expand on, a lot of Sam's ideas, and try to present it in a less polarizing way. Like if you look up Sam Ulano on YouTube, you'll find, where he's blasting the rudiments and, do this, don't do that. Some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. Some of it I take with a grain of salt, and, I think everything has value. So, it'd be worth looking him up a little bit. But before I go, there's just a cute little story that I remember he was telling me. And this is how I knew that he was a born educator, and how I knew that I was in the right place to receive this information from him. So he used to tell me that back when he was young, I guess this would be in the mid 30s or early 30s, 1930s, that is. I forgot how much he said his drum lessons were, but for sake of argument, let's just say there were 20 cents a lesson. So he would go and take a lesson, pay his teacher 20 cents, and then he would have a couple of students that he would teach, and he would charge them each 10 cents. And he would sometimes just be a week ahead of these other students. So he would be teaching them stuff that he learned, a week earlier, charge them 10 cents each. And whether or not he made any money from doing that, it would be enough to continue his own education. So it was a cool little hack, if you will. And by the way, I studied with Sam Ulano from 1987 till about 2012. He passed away, I believe it was in 2014. But the lessons, I don't want to say I wasn't learning anything at some point, because it wasn't really about learning anything new with Sam. Once you've been with a teacher for 20 plus years, it was just having, I guess, someone that you had to like show that you've been responsible in practicing. You had a deadline with the practice materials that he was assigning, and it would motivate me to practice a little bit. Like, oh my God, it's Wednesday and I'm having a lesson on Saturday and I have to be able to perform X, Y, and Z. So it was a good situation. He also became kind of a father figure and a mentor and all those things that go into a teacher and student relationship that lasts over 2 decades long. So love you, Sam, and thank you for a lifetime of education. And you did succeed in making and not necessarily teaching me how to play drums, but teaching me how to make a living playing drums. So hope that helps somebody. Thanks for watching.